All right. So, as you guys know, I like to teach you what no one else is willing to. So, I put together a two-part guide talking about the system behind your streams because this is super convoluted. It's really hard to comprehend how all of these things work together. And there are rules as well. So, I think a lot of people like to complain about the music industry, but they don't even understand how many things there are to navigate in it. So, this is yet another guide by me, The System Behind Your Streams, Part One. We're going to be talking about who makes the rules, and I'm going to share my screen. All right, so here we go again. This is again part of Strategic Artist Society Systems Literacy for Modern Independent Artists, where we go over strategy, systems, information, and hopefully you become more free because of it. So, let's dive in. Who makes the rules to copyright, licensing, market power, regulation, rates, admin, data, money? As you can see, there's 20 pages in this, so who knows how long this video will be. All right. So, boom, you release the song. Now what? You know, as an artist or a manager, especially a newer manager, all you're seeing is music, streams, and money. A listener presses play. From the surface, everything looks pretty simple. I think this is one reason why people are always complaining about the streaming rates because they don't really understand like how much actually goes in to the streaming rates. So let's go into on the other side what the system sees. So three questions arise the instant a play button is pressed. Who gave permission? Who decided what it's worth? And who determines who gets paid? And those three questions are essentially being answered every single time someone listens to music. So, underneath the surface sits an entire architecture, and every layer exists for a reason, obviously. So, one, we have copyright. That is going to establish who owns the exclusive rights to the sound recording. Licensing, which is who's granting permission to use those rights. Market structure, who's negotiating all of these things. And then another layer, regulation, rates, data, and payment. And again, guys, this is not a straightforward subject. If this is the first video that you've seen of mine, please don't start here. This is not a good starting point. You kind of need to understand at least composition and master before you can even comprehend this. So make sure that you go look at some other guides before you jump into this one. So before we follow the money, we need to understand who makes the rules, right? And it goes like this: copyright, licensing, market power, regulation, rates, admin, data, and money. So one song, two rock copyrights. I'm not going to go into this again. For God's sakes, you guys should understand this by now. If you do not understand this by now, then go watch one of my other videos. Okay. You got the musical work, the underlying composition, and you have the sound recording. So the musical work, you got the songwriters, the publishers, the co-writers, and their administrators. In the licensing systems, performing rights organizations, mechanical licensing, and the MLC. Sound recording, which is the master, it's recorded performance. This is the stakeholders for that are recording artists, labels, master rights owners, and then the licensing systems are labels and distributors, DSP licensing agreements, and sound exchange for non-interactive digital performances. If you don't know what non-interactive means, go watch another one of my videos. It's somewhere in there. So one stream can implicate multiple rights. Each right travels through its own system, right? There's one stream, but there's two copyrights and multiple licensing systems. And this is where everything gets really, really complex. So let's talk about the copyright first. So copyright grants a rights holder exclusive rights over specific uses of a protected work, such as reproduction, distribution, public performance, and others defined under this. You can look that up. You can ask a lawyer friend. I'm not getting into it. So in practical terms, if you control the copyright, others cannot exploit those protected uses without your permission or a licensing mechanism. That exclusivity is what gives a copyright its economic values because it creates a right to license and therefore a right to be compensated. The system works elegantly at small scale. one rights holder, one license, one negotiation. As it scales, that's when it breaks. That's what everyone in the music industry on the business side knows. The scale that the music industry is currently at is why all of this is broken. So, what happens when there's millions of exclusive rights, millions of rights holders, and billions of uses? That's what we are all dealing with right now. So, here's the copyright value chain. You have a song where creative work is produced, and then the copyright, which is automatically attached. Then you have exclusive rights that are granted to you. And then you have the ability to license, which creates economic value. And this works well when there's not a lot of players, but once there's a bunch going on, it causes issues. So, this is essentially what we're talking about in this portion of it. One song, it's manageable. There's two negotiating parties. 1,000 songs, it gets complicated. There's a lot of overhead, a lot of parties. 1,000,000 songs, enormous transaction costs before single play. 100 million songs, not realistically scalable through individual negotiation. So each negotiation requires identifying a rights holder, establishing terms, executing an agreement, and tracking usage. And that's across every single work, every single use of the work, and every single territory that the work is exploited in. So as you can see here, the transaction cost just goes crazy the more songs that go into the market. So transaction costs grow at a rate that makes individual negotiation impossible at the scale that we're doing this. The cost of licensing the catalog would exceed the cost of building the platform. So, how do you license copyrights at scale? You aggregate the rights and create standardized licensing systems. Now, that's what has occurred. So instead of thousands of individual bilateral negotiations, intermediaries and licensing structures consolidate the rights into manageable pathways. Aggregation transforms an impossible transaction into a workable market. So before aggregation, a streaming service must connect every individual rights holder independently, which doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense, guys. We can't do that. So after aggregation, which is where we operate today, a single intermediary consolidates the rights, right? One deal, unlimited access to millions of works. So the DSP deals with the intermediary, and then the intermediary deals with the rights holder. So how aggregation works. And aggregation is essentially the compiling of data so that way you can work with it. So how aggregation works in these specific instances is that the publishers, they aggregate and ingest the songwriter catalogs. Performing rights organizations aggregate public performance rights across catalogs. Blanket licenses is one agreement that allows essentially the DSP to license any work within that group of works. And then you have statutory licenses, which are Congress created frameworks for qualifying uses. All these things are existing simultaneously and interact with each other in the landscape of the music industry. Now, why am I teaching this? Well, because I kind of learned the music industry through trial and error, through helping various different team members on an artist team, on a label, on a management team, publishing, metadata, etc. I've interacted with many of the players in the music industry. And for me, my brain works by connecting dots. So for me to see one thing and another thing, I instinctively want to know, how do these things work together? And that's what this guide is attempting to shine light on. If it goes over your head, don't feel bad. Even though I learned all of this and I have compiled this information into one place and refined it into something I feel is kind of digestible, it's very convoluted. It might not take you one day to understand this. You may have to continuously revisit these concepts, because even people within these systems don't understand how they all work together, because I think it's just a shit show, right? So anyway, let's keep going. So The problem with aggregation, right, is that it also concentrates negotiating power. So let's say we have, you know, only one performing rights organization. They could essentially set whatever prices they want. There would be no market competition, and then supply and demand would be all unbalanced because there would be no competition in pricing. And I'm trying to make this as simple as possible, but this is not a simple subject. So, the same thing that makes licensing efficient can create market power. So, the efficiency gain, where everything's aggregated under a single organization, individual transactions become dramatically easier. And this is a measurable economic value. Blanket licensing is a rational market response to a genuine transaction cost problem. So, a thing that I hear a lot is that music artists are like, oh, the music's a scam and all this stuff. But it's like, unless you understand the mechanics of what's actually taking place, you don't understand why things are the way they are. And I'm not advocating that they're good by any means, but I think when you understand from this vantage point, it does help you wrap your head around how things are, why they are the way they are, and then also it just orients you better as an artist or a team member in what can be negotiated. Where is your negotiation power? Where is your leverage, right? So I always want people to have all the information they need to make informed decisions for themselves. I think that's very important. So again, we talked about efficiency happening through blanket licenses and intermediaries. So now let's talk about the structural reality of that, right? So the organizations controlling large portions of commercially necessary catalog can also become extremely powerful in any negotiation, right? If a licensee cannot practically operate without access to a particular aggregated repertoire, the aggregator holds significant leverage, meaning they can, again, like I said, set prices and stuff like that. So the same thing that makes licensing efficient can also create the market power. And then there's something else that I learned about, which makes this even more fucking complicated, is antitrust, right? And again, if you have some lawyer friends, take them to coffee, ask them about this. I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. I think it's right. I'm pretty sure it's correct. I double checked all my sources, but I'm doing my best to bring you guys this information. So give me some grace. But antitrust is the body of law concerned with preserving competition, right? And addressing certain anti competitive conduct and concentrations of market power. So essentially, they're just making sure monopolies don't happen. Um, it's rigorous framework for evaluating how economic power is exercised in markets. So first we had the inefficiencies of licensing at scale. So then we created these intermediaries that are aggregating things. But now we're like, oh, well, if we have, you know, somebody doing the intermediary thing, they can basically control the market. Well, antitrust comes in and says, nah, we ain't doing that. So, in plain English, antitrust law is a set of rules. So, what we're talking about right now is rules that stops any one company or group of companies acting together from getting so much control over a market that everyone else, competitors, customers, creators, lose the ability to negotiate on fair terms. So think of antitrust as a referee that keeps powerful players from rigging the game. I think it's also worth mentioning that antitrust is the very thing that stops independent artists from all banding together and controlling the market as well. So, why does it matter? It's the structural reality that the US antitrust enforcement in music licensing has addressed for over 80 years. The architecture of collective licensing in the United States was built in direct response to this tension. Okay. So, copyright versus antitrust. There is a foundational tension here. These two bodies of law can pull in opposite directions. Understanding their relationship is essential to understanding why music licensing system is structured the way it is, because two things can be true. And we're going to exercise your ability to hold two things at once on this slide. So, what's happening with my camera? Okay, so anyway, copyright, right? You have exclusive rights. The purpose there is to incentivize creation and artistic investment, protect ownership of the creative works, enable licensing and market formation, and generate economic value from exclusivity. And the core logic there is that exclusivity is the point. Copyright intentionally creates a barrier to unauthorized use. Without exclusivity, there's no licensing, right? You can't say everyone owns this, because once everyone owns it, then everyone can use it. So you create something, ownership is determined, and then you can put it into the world of commerce and monetize it, right? And then antitrust says, but markets still need competition. So antitrust is focused on competition and market structure, coordinated behavior among competitors, market power and its exercise, and monopolization and exclusionary practices. And the core logic there is that a rights holder can hold a valid copyright and still face antitrust scrutiny for how that right is exercised in a market context. So both can be true. This is not a bug. It's a foundation. It's foundational to understanding why music licensing is the way it is. And again, guys, go down these rabbit holes on your own. I'm just trying to give you a starting point. I want you to understand how convoluted this really is, because as everyone's villainizing the music industry, which I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with, there's also a bunch of other shit that nobody knows about that's going on, in that these people at these levels are navigating, that are problems that become problems downstream to artists, or concerns, or at the very least affect artists, but that artists don't even know exist, right? So ASCAP and BMI, this slide is titled "The Tension Made Real." Okay, so a venue, broadcaster, or streaming service cannot practically negotiate separately with every single songwriter whose music might be performed or streamed. It's impossible. It doesn't make sense, right? So ASCAP and BMI solved this problem and also created a new one simultaneously. So on the efficiency side of things, there's millions of works that are aggregated under ASCAP and BMI. There's blanket licensing, single fee, full repertoire access, and then there's efficiency. Venues, broadcasters, and DSPs can operate how they need to because of these blanket licenses. So they're not like negotiating with Billy Joel, like, hey, can I please use your song for $40 a billion times? It doesn't, it's not scalable, it doesn't make sense, right? And then on the other side of that, the antitrust oversight pathway, there's a large aggregated repertoire, which is commercially needed. And then there's market power to be considered, leverage over any party needing access. And then there's consent decrees, which is interesting, Department of Justice oversight since 1941. So I don't think that, I know I certainly didn't know coming into the music industry as the artist that music has DOJ oversight through antitrust. Okay. So let's go into this a little bit. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I didn't go to law school. I know some lawyers. Go ask the lawyers you know. Sherman Act 1, Section 1, 1941. The original consent decrees are products of DOJ lawsuits brought under Section 1 of the Sherman Act, addressing competitive concerns arising from the market power each organization acquired through the aggregation of public performance rights. So the way that I kind of synthesized this was basically like, if ASCAP and BMI have access to all the songs, they could essentially strong arm licensing prices. And that's why antitrust is here, because they're like, nah, there's got to be some oversight. So ASCAP and BMI have operated under the DOJ consent decree since 1941, subject to a periodic review and amendment. The ASCAP decree was last amended in 2001, where BMI's was in 1994. And the key lesson here is that collective licensing is not necessarily anti competitive, but it does require ongoing oversight to balance efficiency with competition. Both flows exist simultaneously. So, both of these things are happening at the same time, because we need the efficiency because of just the scale of where music's at, but also the players need to be held accountable to make sure they're not monopolizing everything. Okay, so you thought that was a lot. Well, guess what? We're only halfway through. This is the three-way tension that exists in the music industry, specifically in the licensing department, right? So this triangle is a conceptual centerpiece of the entire system. Every institution I'm going to go over in part 1 and 2 of this, the PROs, the CRB, and the MLC, is a direct response to this tension. Many structures that seem strange or arbitrary in the music business exist precisely because policymakers are trying to balance all three of these forces simultaneously, which the deeper I go into this, the more complicated it gets. And the more I'm like, you know what? I thought I could solve all the music industry's problems. I can't. But what I can do is highlight them. So let's just take a quick look at this, right? So we got copyright owners here. That's usually the artists, the performers, whoever's owning the master. Um, Also, the composition or whatever. And then we have competitive markets down here and we have music services here. And they're all kind of in direct conflict to each other. So the copyright owners, the rights holders, are in direct conflict, versus control versus open market principles. So competitive markets require workable market structures, preventing unchecked power over commercially necessary resources. Right? So they want more value, but they're also operating under these rules, right? And then the competitive markets and the music services are in direct conflict over market power and access fairness, right? Because music services want scalable access to repertoire and predictable licensing costs for a viable business. Imagine if a DSP had to negotiate with every single artist and songwriter on their platform. It wouldn't be feasible, both economically and from a time bandwidth standpoint. So then you have the music services that are in direct conflict with the copyright owners over terms of access and compensation. So these three things are all coming to the same party and they don't got beef, but they're not like completely cordial either. They're trying to be cordial, but they're all operating in the same room, so to speak. So these three forces are often in direct conflict, kind of like I just said. Maximizing any one of them can undermine the other. So the institutions that govern music licensing are not arbitrary. They're engineering solutions to a genuine multi-party optimization problem. And this is why each force exists. Copyright owners control and fair compensation. Without protection, incentive to create collapse. Music services, they want scalable access and predictable costs. Without this, streaming can't be built. And we're all going back to buying physical copies, which everyone loves to say. But I don't know about you. My music tastes all over the place. And I don't want to carry around a damn binder full of CDs or SD cards or whatever the hell, right? And then you have competitive markets, workable structures without competition, power concentrates unchecked. So many people think that certain players in the music industry already have too much power. And I would just like to say the power that certain people have in the music industry or companies is still being checked. So imagine how crazy it would be if it was unchecked. Okay, let's keep going. Not every music license is negotiated from scratch. Um, what is a statutory license? I wish I had a little bubble lawyer that could come in and tell y'all, but I'm going to tell you. So, Congress has created a statutory licensing framework for certain uses of copyright works, which are mechanisms that allow qualifying users to obtain specified rights without individually negotiating permission from every copyright owner. Again, individually negotiating copyright and permission is not viable. Okay. When statutory requirements are satisfied, the license is available as a matter of law. The copyright owner cannot simply refuse. This is a fundamental departure from a standard contract principle. So, Section 115 of the Copyright Act established the compulsory mechanical licensing framework for musical works. Originally designed for physical recordings, also known as a cover song license, later extended to digital uses. For covered digital uses, interactive streams, permanent downloads, and limited downloads, Section 115 became central to how streaming services obtain mechanical licenses for musical works at scale. So basically, Congress is like, hey, we're setting the statutory license. If the qualified user meets the criteria, then the license is available by law and the royalties are paid under the terms. Statutory licensing solves the permission problem at scale. Again, guys, this is a scale game. Why is all of this kind of so murky? Is because music has scaled way past the original infrastructure that it was built in. So, but it immediately raises a new question because this is the music industry. So, as we create solutions, we also create problems. If the law creates the licensing mechanism, who determines the price? I like to know, right? Enter the Copyright Royalty Board. Now, these guys are another player in this chessboard that you didn't even know existed because you don't know the industry you're in. The Copyright Royalty Board consists of copyright royalty judges who establish rates and terms for certain statutory licenses under the U.S. copyright law, and they operate within the Library of Congress. For interactive streaming mechanicals, the relevant proceeding is Phono 5, covering the period January 1, 23 through January 31, 2027. Now, if you want to look up the docket number, it's right here. You could totally do that. But you need to understand the Copyright Royalty Board is not a performing rights organization. It's not a collection society. It's not a publisher or a distributor, and it's not the MLC. This is simply a rate setting tribunal. Okay. They just come together and chit chat about how much stuff should be, what rates should be set. Are they fair? Are they not fair? And it's just really important that you realize it's not any of these things because we're dealing with all these different players. It really is like a chessboard. If you play chess, you know that each piece is allowed to do different things. It's allowed to move a certain way. And that's kind of how the music industry is. And again, guys, this shit is deep and complex. So just if you're not asleep yet, good on you for being here. Make sure you get some water. Hydrate your brain because this is a lot. So, the structural logic is that Congress creates the statutory license under the Copyright Act, and then the Copyright Royalty Board, which is who we're talking about right now, determines the applicable rates and terms through adversarial proceedings, which means all these players that are in the ecosystem of music streaming, they're all kind of chit chatting back and forth. And they're like, no, I think it should be more. No, I think it should be less. And eventually they come to agreeable terms. And then the DSPs operate under the rules and those rates that the Copyright Royalty Board sets. And they pay those royalties according to the rates and reporting usage that was set by the CRB. And once that happens, at the rates the CRB established for the works that are streamed, the royalties are then calculated. So the Copyright Royalty Board helps answer how much, but it does not answer who gets the money. Those are two separate problems requiring separate institutions. But again, I wanted to make this because all of these players are interacting with each other, and this is how it works, right? So royalty rates are part law, part economics, and part negotiation. So let's talk about royalty rates for a second. It's not an administrative rubber stamp. The CRB rate proceedings are adversarial, legal, and economic proceedings. Like I said before, there's a bunch of people that are in the space of streaming that are participants, and they're basically going back and forth trying to figure it out. Some of them are for paying more, some are for paying less. And I'll go over the players that are sitting at that table in just a second. So, parties with major financial interests submit evidence, economic analysis, and legal arguments before the copyright royalty judges. The outcomes directly determine what songwriters and publishers earn from every stream. So, this is about the composition. For interactive streaming, the judges evaluate evidence under a willing buyer, willing seller framework. What would a willing buyer pay and a willing seller accept in a hypothetical competitive market? So, again, this is a lot about economics. The proceeding is designed to simulate market outcomes that the regulatory context prevents from occurring naturally, right? And then the Phono 5 participants, basically, no single industry participant simply decides the rate. I already said that. Participants in Phono proceedings have included Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Google, Pandora, National Music Publishers Association, Songwriters, Nashville Songwriters Association International, and labels, Sony, UMG, Warner. So imagine all these guys sitting at a table arguing over how much everything should cost. Again, it's part legal, part economic, part negotiation. All major industry stakeholders are present. The outcome applies to every qualifying streams in the United States for the duration of the rate period. And let's go back up. How long is it? It's 4 years, isn't it? Yep, every 4 years. So a lot of people think that the rates went up, but if you look at how it was determined, it basically went up because of inflation, not because you wanted to get paid more. Okay, so let's keep going. But there was still a massive digital licensing problem. So even with the statutory license in place, a royalty rate established, and a stream confirmed, the system still needed to answer a difficult question. Who owns this song? And this is why I'm always complaining about metadata and data cleanliness, because that's the part that gets you paid. So what we've talked about up until this point is essentially the players in the landscape you're operating in, and the rules that everyone has to adhere to, essentially. We also talked about the tension that exists amongst these players and why that tension exists. So now we're getting into another part of the problem, which is, okay, who owns this stuff? How can we tell, right? So first, a stream happens, the stream is confirmed, a listener played the track, the usage data exists. Then it goes into royalty obligation. Because of a statutory mechanical royalty, right? We talked about that earlier. It's owed under Section 115. So those two things happen. Now we're like, okay, the rights holder. There's no authoritative database, right? So money sits in limbo. Ownership is so hard to identify because musical work ownership is fragmented across millions of copyrights, co-writers, publishers, administrators, and catalog acquisition people with no single authoritative database. Under the pre-MMA structure, digital services had to obtain mechanical licenses on a song-by-song basis. Now they don't, remember, because we talked about blanket licenses and the compulsory licenses. Now, the consequences at streaming scale, this created huge, huge gaps, which is something that I've been working on the past 2 years, helping fix. Unmatched works, unpaid royalties, and mounting legal exposure. A stream could occur, a royalty obligation could exist, and the rights holder could still be a mystery. The data problem is as significant as the licensing problem. Rates and permissions meant nothing if the money couldn't find its owner, right? So at that point, you know the rules, you know how everything works together. That doesn't mean that you're going to get your money. So Congress redesigned mechanical licensing in the digital landscape. The Music Modernization Act of 2018, also known as MMA, not mixed martial arts, significantly restructured how eligible digital mechanical licenses for musical works are administered in the United States. The MMA updates copyright law to make statutory licensing more fair for creators and more efficient for digital music providers, right? So there's a couple parts to that. So before the MMA Act, DSPs had to interact with millions of individual works, song by song mechanical licensing, fragmented, costly, legally exposed, unmatched works, and unpaid royalties accumulate. Now, after the MMA, the DSP operates under Section 115 blanket license and their centralized administration. The blanket license dramatically reduced transaction costs and consolidated administration, but someone needed to actually run that, and that is the MLC. So let's go back up here into Title 1, 2, 3, so that way you know what the hell I'm talking about. So, Title I, Musical Works Modernization Act, replaced the song by song compulsory licensing structure with a blanket licensing system for digital music providers to make and distribute digital phonorecord deliveries, interactive streams, permanent downloads, limited downloads. The most structurally significant change. It changed everything, right? Then you have Title II, Classics Protection and Access Act, brought pre-1972 sound recordings partially into the federal copyright system, addressing a long-standing gap in federal protection for recordings made before the 1972 Copyright Act. And then Title III, Allocation for Music Producers Act, created a payment mechanism for producers, mixers, and engineers, enabling them to receive a defined share of sound exchange royalties through a letter of direction from a featured artist. So a LOD. And that's the MLC, right? So the MLC is a nonprofit entity designated by the U.S. Copyright Office to administer Section 115 blanket mechanical licenses for eligible digital uses. And this has been operational since January 1, 21. The core responsibilities are to receive usage reports and mechanical royalties from DSPs, to maintain musical work ownership data in a publicly accessible database, to match reported sound recording usage to musical works and their owners, and distribute royalties to identified rights holders, publishers, administrators, and self-administered songwriters. Okay, so basically, everything that goes through that Section 115, the blanket license, MLC is distributing the money for that. So to date, $4 billion has been distributed in streaming royalties. It's been in operation since 2021. We already talked about that. And the MLC is funded by DSPs through administrative assessments set by who? The copyright royalty judges, not by rights holders. So this is deliberate, and it's a choice to avoid reducing the royalties flowing to songwriters and publishers. So the Copyright Royalty Board essentially forces the DSPs to fund the MLC, so that way the MLC isn't funded from your royalties. But the CRB, Copyright Royalty Board, and MLC, Mechanical Licensing Collective, is not the same thing. The MLC administers the blanket license and the royalty distribution system. The CRB simply sets how much DSPs have to pay to fund the MLC. And even still, guys, you saw me scroll up here just to confirm that I was saying it right, because all of this stuff is very convoluted. It's complex. It's a web. Mechanical Licensing Collective. Again, just a reminder, if this is going over your head or is blowing your fucking mind, that's okay. There's a part 2. So prepare to be even more mind blown. Okay, so now we talked about all that. Let's go ahead and put this system together. So these entities do not sit in a simple hierarchy. Nothing here has been simple. Nothing here has been simple. Why would the hierarchy of the music industry be simple. Nothing here is simple. We're causing solutions, and where those solutions we're creating are causing more problems. And those problems and solutions have to exist simultaneously. So let's this is my best attempt. I worked on this a couple times. Obviously, I used AI to put this together. Otherwise, I would never do all this. It's way too much work. But I think knowledge is important. So now that we've put the system together, it's not simple. The law flows from Congress, the rates flow from the Copyright Royalty Board, the licensing flows through performing rights organizations and the MLC, and money flows to rights holders, but only if the data connects the stream to the owner. Okay. You only get your money if the data connected to your song goes to you. And that's why I think attribution is going to be, if not already, one of the biggest issues. Like, everyone's calling it a metadata and rights issue, but like attribution is the problem, in my opinion. And it's bigger than just these data points. So, anyways, a lawmaker, Congress, creates copyright law and the MMA framework. And then you have regulators who are the Copyright Royalty Board and the DOJ. And there's antitrust oversight that exists here as well, and that goes into the performing rights organizations. Then you have the intermediaries, which is a performing rights organization. The intermediaries set the rate and terms from the CRB, or the CRB sets the rate and term for the intermediaries. And then there are service providers, DSPs, and collecting entities, MLC, and rights holders. Then you get your money, right? Rate setting, we have here. Licensing and administration, you can see travels all over this place. And again, guys, like, I understand this practically, but even trying to explain this to you is not easy, right? Because I don't want to misspeak. I don't want to say the wrong thing, but also it's actively confusing because it's so convoluted. So Congress establishes copyright law, statutory licenses, and the Modern Music Modernization Act. The DOJ and courts enforce antitrust, consent decrees, and competition oversight. Then you have the Copyright Royalty Board, which sets rates and terms through Phono 5. And then you have the DSPs here that get blanket licenses, have usage reporting and royalty payments. Then you have the performing rights organizations and the MLC, licensing administration, matching distribution. And then you have the rights holders, the recipients of the money. And the big idea here is that every institution in the music industry is a response to a problem created by the institution before it. The architecture is the argument. Copyright creates exclusivity. Exclusivity creates licensing markets. Scale requires aggregation. Aggregation can create market power. Market power creates competition concerns. Some markets receive regulatory intervention. Statutory licenses require rates. Rates require rate setting mechanisms via the Copyright Royalty Board, and rates require administration, and administration requires data. And data is where everything is consistently breaking. The entire architecture collapses at the final step if a stream cannot be matched to its owner. Every layer of the system above this point is rendered ineffective by the data failure below it. And this is a responsibility on the artist and the creator and the rights holders to provide the information to the relevant parties. And we're going to go over part 2 next, because if this wasn't enough, there's a lot more to go over. So part 2 is going to be, where does the money go? So as you can see, we've covered copyright, licensing, market power, regulation, rates, administration, data. Now we're at the money part, everyone's favorite part. So we've established copyright, antitrust, statutory licensing, copyright royalty board, modern Music Modernization Act, and the Mechanical Licensing Collective. But none of this guarantees that you get paid, because the system still has to connect a stream to a recording and composition, and to a owner, a payee, and then turn into money. And that connection depends entirely on data, metadata, ownership records, usage matching, and the infrastructure that links a play to a payment. So in part 2, what we're going to go over is matching metadata, the black box, and getting paid, the unmatched royalties pool, why metadata is a structural problem, and how money gets stranded, what artists and songwriters can do about it. If you want to check me, you can look at all these sources. And if you want this guide or whatever, I'll put a link somewhere. But yeah, guys, the music industry, that's only part 1. All we went over was who makes the rules. So we just went over who makes the rules in the system, right? And next we're going to go over the pipes. So if you want to see part 2, find it somewhere. But thanks for watching again. I'm Big Soph. I'm just here to tell you, you don't know the industry you're in, and I hope this gave you a little bit of clarity on that.